It was a beautiful, sunny afternoon when the protagonist and their 5-year-old daughter arrived at the park, eager to enjoy a peaceful day out. The sky was clear and the air had a gentle warmth, perfect for a stroll. The little girl skipped ahead, giggling as she chased a butterfly, her laughter echoing through the quiet park. The protagonist, smiling at the simple joy of the moment, followed at a leisurely pace. They found a cozy bench near the playground, shaded by a large oak tree, and settled in. As they sat, they began to chat about the little things, how the flowers were blooming or how their daughter was getting better at tying her shoes. The conversation flowed easily, and for a moment, everything felt perfect, untouched by any worry or concern. The protagonist's heart swelled with pride and love as they watched their daughter swing her legs playfully, her face beaming with happiness. Unbeknownst to them, a presence lingered in the background. The camera subtly panned to Karen, standing across the park, her eyes fixed on the family. Her expression was unreadable, her posture rigid. She was watching them from a distance, silent and still, her presence almost unnoticed by the innocent moments unfolding before her. But the peaceful day would not last, and the calm before the storm would soon give way to something far darker, something neither the protagonist nor their daughter could have ever imagined. As the protagonist settled into the park bench, they noticed a figure standing off to the side. It was a woman, tall and striking, though something about her stance made her seem out of place in the otherwise serene setting. The woman, Karen, stood a few yards away, her gaze fixed intently on the protagonist and their daughter. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and there was an undeniable tension in the air. Karen's expression was hard to read, but there was a subtle coldness in her stare. The protagonist felt a flicker of discomfort, but quickly dismissed it. They turned back to their daughter, who was still swinging her legs happily, oblivious to the strange encounter. The protagonist shrugged it off, convinced it was nothing more than an awkward coincidence. It was a beautiful day, after all, and they were determined to enjoy it. The minutes passed in quiet bliss, with the protagonist watching their daughter play. But then, as if summoned by some unseen force, Karen began to walk towards them. Her steps were deliberate, almost calculated, as if she had been waiting for the right moment to approach. The protagonist looked up again, their sense of unease creeping back. Karen stopped just a few feet away, standing tall and rigid. She offered a stiff, almost forced smile. "Nice day, isn't it?" Karen said, her voice polite but lacking warmth. The greeting hung in the air, awkward and uncomfortable. The protagonist nodded, unsure of what to say. Karen's eyes continued to linger on their daughter, not in admiration, but in a way that felt unsettling, like she was sizing them up. "Yes," the protagonist replied, forcing a smile, trying to keep the conversation light. "It's perfect weather for a day in the park." But Karen said nothing further, her gaze still intense and lingering on the family, and that odd feeling of unease settled deeper in the protagonist's chest. They quickly turned their attention back to their daughter, not wanting to engage further, but sensing that something wasn't quite right. The tension in the air was palpable as Karen lingered near the protagonist and their daughter, her eyes now fixed not just on the little girl, but on every movement she made. The protagonist tried to ignore her, focusing instead on the peaceful afternoon, but the silence between them was becoming more uncomfortable by the second. Finally, Karen broke the stillness with a comment that seemed innocuous at first, but her tone made it clear she wasn't just making an observation. "She's a bit loud, isn't she?" Karen said, her voice casual, but there was an edge to it that set the protagonist on alert. "I mean, I don't mind children, but maybe she could tone it down a bit. It's a public space, after all." The words stung, though the protagonist tried to mask it with a forced smile. They turned to look at their daughter, who was now spinning in circles with a carefree joy, her laughter ringing through the air. "Oh, she's just having fun," the protagonist replied, keeping their voice even. "She's not bothering anyone." It was meant to be a polite, neutral response, but Karen didn't seem satisfied with it. Instead of backing off, she pressed further, her gaze narrowing as she looked from the protagonist to their daughter and back again. Well, it's not just the noise, she continued, her words dripping with condescension. It's the way she behaves. I'm just saying, maybe you should teach her a little more discipline. Kids today, the protagonist's patience was wearing thin. They hadn't asked for Karen's unsolicited advice, and they didn't appreciate her judgmental tone. I'm sure she'll be fine, they said, trying to keep the situation calm. Every kid expresses themselves differently. We all have our own ways of enjoying the day. But Karen wasn't having it. Her lips curled into a tight, almost imperceptible sneer. Oh, I'm sure. But not everyone appreciates the exuberance, she said, her voice now laced with a subtle, mocking sarcasm. The protagonist could feel the temperature of the conversation rising, and their smile faltered as their patience quickly evaporated. They had hoped the interaction would end with a simple exchange, but Karen seemed determined to escalate it. Is there something you need? The protagonist finally asked, their voice growing colder, a sharp edge creeping in despite their attempt to stay composed. Because we're just trying to enjoy the day with my daughter. Karen's eyes flashed with something unsettling, anger perhaps, or resentment, but she didn't back down. Instead, she leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a near whisper as she muttered, maybe if you spent less time letting her run wild, you wouldn't be so oblivious to how others feel. The words hung in the air, thick with passive-aggressive venom, and for a brief moment the protagonist considered walking away, but they knew they couldn't let this go. The tension between them had grown too thick, and the atmosphere had shifted from uncomfortable to outright hostile. What had started as a simple interaction was now something much darker, an unsettling confrontation that neither party could easily walk away from. The words hung in the air, thick with hostility, as the confrontation escalated. Karen stood there, her eyes locked on the protagonist, the tension between them palpable. In that moment, everything seemed to freeze. The distant sound of children laughing, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the bright, golden sunlight streaming through the trees. And then, without warning, Karen's hand moved. It happened so quickly, so shockingly, that for a second the protagonist couldn't comprehend what was happening. A flash of metal, cold and sudden, was the only warning before a sharp, deafening sound shattered the silence. The gunshot echoed across the park, sending a jolt of terror through the protagonist's body. Their hearts stopped as they turned, their gaze following the direction of the noise. And there, in front of them, their 5-year-old daughter, who had been playfully spinning in circles just moments ago, crumpled to the ground. The world seemed to spin as the protagonist's mind struggled to process what they were seeing. No, 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 and oh, the protagonist screamed, rushing to their daughter's side. Their legs felt like lead as they stumbled over to her, dropping to the ground beside her. Blood pooled on the ground beneath their little girl, and the sight of it sent a wave of nausea crashing over them. Their daughter, wide-eyed and gasping for air, clutched at her stomach, her small body racked with pain. The protagonist's hands shook uncontrollably as they tried to apply pressure to the wound, but the blood kept coming, staining their hands, their clothes. Please, baby, stay with me, the protagonist pleaded, their voice breaking as they spoke to their daughter, their eyes desperate. The words barely registered in their mind as they frantically looked around, searching for anyone who could help. They could hear their daughter's soft cries, a sound that seemed to echo in the protagonist's ears, a painful reminder of a nightmare that was unfolding before them. Help! Somebody, please help! The protagonist screamed, their voice raw with fear and panic. But the park was eerily quiet now, as if the world itself had fallen into a stunned silence. The protagonist could see people in the distance, standing frozen, too shocked or too frightened to move. In the midst of the chaos, Karen stood a few feet away, her face eerily calm, her hand still clutching the gun. The protagonist's eyes locked onto hers, but instead of the remorse or fear they expected, they saw something else, something cold, almost detached. Karen didn't flinch, didn't react to the horror she had just caused. She stood there, emotionless, like she was watching a scene unfold on a screen rather than participating in the tragedy she had created. The protagonist's chest tightened as they struggled to keep their composure, trying to stop the bleeding, trying to comfort their daughter, who was slipping in and out of consciousness. Their heart was pounding in their chest, their mind spinning in a haze of disbelief. How could this happen? How could Karen, someone they had seen almost daily in the neighborhood, do something so violent, so utterly horrifying? With shaking hands, the protagonist fumbled for their phone, pressing the emergency number with frantic fingers. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice came through the line, cold and calm in contrast to the chaos that surrounded the protagonist. Please, my daughter's been shot. She's bleeding and I don't know what to do. Please, you have to help her. The words tumbled out in a frantic rush, barely comprehensible. The dispatcher's voice grew more urgent, asking for the location, asking for more details, but all the protagonist could focus on was their daughter, fighting to stay awake, her breathing shallow and weak. It felt like hours passed before help arrived, though it was only moments. The police and paramedics finally made their way through the park, and the moment they did, everything seemed to shift. The protagonist's hands, still soaked in their daughter's blood, were gently pulled away as paramedics took over. The scene was chaotic, a blur of flashing lights, rushing bodies, and the overwhelming sound of sirens. But through it all, one thing was clear. The calm, quiet park had been shattered, and there was no going back. The park, once a serene and peaceful space, had been transformed into a chaotic scene of horror. As the protagonist knelt beside their daughter, whose small body lay crumpled on the ground, the air around them seemed to grow heavy with disbelief and fear. Their hands, trembling uncontrollably, pressed down on the wound in an attempt to stop the bleeding, but the blood kept flowing, a cruel reminder of how fragile life could be. The once cheerful atmosphere of the park was now punctuated by screams, gasps, and the faint sounds of footsteps running away in panic. Onlookers stood frozen at first, their faces a mix of shock, confusion, and terror. The quiet chatter of a peaceful afternoon was replaced by the sharp sound of a child's cry for help echoing through the park. Some people stood in the distance, too stunned to move, while others took hesitant steps toward the scene, unsure of what to do or how to help. But there was one thing they all had in common: the shock on their faces, as if they couldn't fathom what was happening right before their eyes. The protagonist's mind raced, desperate for any kind of assistance, but the reality of the situation was setting in with each passing second. The park had become a stage for an unimaginable tragedy, and time seemed to stretch, every second feeling like an eternity. As the protagonist continued to try and keep their daughter conscious, more people began to scatter, some running to their phones to call 911, while others simply backed away, unable to cope with the raw violence unfolding before them. The protagonist could hear the frantic dialing of numbers, but the sound only seemed to heighten their panic. The park had turned into a frenzy of conflicting actions. Some people rushed to help, others stood at a distance, paralyzed by fear or uncertainty. "Help her! Please, someone help me!" the protagonist screamed, their voice hoarse with desperation. They could barely keep it together, their hands slick with blood, their heart hammering in their chest as they tried to stop the bleeding. "Somebody, please!" they shouted again, voice breaking as their eyes scanned the crowd for any sign of help. But the faces around them were those of strangers, frozen and unable to move. It felt like the world had slowed down, every second stretching into an unbearable eternity. Karen, the woman who had caused it all, stood at a distance, as if disconnected from the chaos she had ignited. Her eyes remained emotionless, watching the unfolding scene without a flicker of remorse. The protagonist's gaze snapped toward her, but Karen didn't move, didn't flinch. It was as if she was watching a show, indifferent to the pain and suffering that was happening mere feet away from her. This realization made the protagonist's blood boil, their stomach churn with a mix of anger and disbelief. The paramedics and police were still a distant promise, the sirens barely audible in the background, lost in the madness of the moment. The protagonist's vision blurred with tears, but they couldn't afford to break down now, not when their daughter was lying there, fighting for her life. They had to keep fighting, even if it felt like they were fighting alone. Amid the frenzy, where the protagonist's heart raced and their hands trembled with desperation, there stood Karen, still and eerily calm, as though the violence she had just unleashed hadn't even touched her. While the park had descended into chaos, with bystanders trying to grasp the magnitude of what had just occurred, Karen appeared detached from the madness she had caused. She was not rushing to help, not looking for the nearest exit, but instead standing there with a cold, vacant expression. Her eyes, void of remorse, flickered briefly toward the protagonist, but she showed no signs of concern or guilt. It was as if the tragedy unfolding before her was nothing more than a distant reality, completely separate from her own. The protagonist, unable to contain the rage and disbelief that was building inside, finally forced themselves to stand, shaking with fury and exhaustion. Their gaze was locked on Karen, and every step they took toward her felt like a monumental effort against the overwhelming emotions consuming them. "What did you do?" The protagonist's voice cracked, their words a mixture of shock, anger, and a sense of desperate need for understanding. "Why? What could possibly justify this?" The words barely escaped, raw and unintelligible, like a parent who had just witnessed the most horrific act against their child. Karen stood, motionless, staring back at the protagonist, and then, as if detached from reality, she muttered something almost inaudible. She needed to learn. She needed to be taught. "There's a way to respect authority," Karen mumbled, her tone far too casual for the horror she had just inflicted. She was disrespecting me, and she needed to understand there are consequences. People like her don't just get away with things. The explanation was nonsensical, delusional even. It was as though Karen was caught in a twisted rationalization of her actions, convincing herself that the violent act was somehow justified, something necessary, something that needed to happen. The words stung, and yet they made no sense at all. The protagonist stood there, their mind reeling, unable to fully comprehend what Karen had just said. How could anyone believe this? How could someone do this to an innocent child and then justify it with such madness? The rage within the protagonist surged, mixing with a deep, gut-wrenching disbelief. How could Karen, standing there with such eerie calmness, see their daughter as anything other than an innocent child? The juxtaposition of the violent act and Karen's detached demeanor only deepened the protagonist's anger. The scene before them felt surreal, as if they were stuck in some horrible nightmare that they couldn't wake up from. The questions rushed through their mind, but no answers could make sense of the chaos that had just unfolded. Their daughter lay in a pool of blood, fighting for her life, while Karen stood there, lost in a delusion of her own making, incapable of seeing the truth of her actions. The protagonist's anger flared like wildfire, but it was quickly swallowed by the crushing realization that the woman standing before them was not only dangerous, but also deeply unhinged. The sound of sirens pierced the chaos, cutting through the air like a sharp knife. The protagonist, still kneeling by their daughter, felt a fleeting sense of hope as the distant wail of emergency vehicles grew louder. The world seemed to slow down as they looked around, frantic for any sign of help. A moment later, police cars and ambulances screeched into the park, their flashing lights reflecting off the wet pavement, casting an eerie glow across the scene. The sight of the first responders rushing in brought a sense of urgency and relief, but it also highlighted just how severe the situation had become. It was no longer just a tragic accident, it was a full-blown crisis. Paramedics sprinted toward the protagonist and their daughter, immediately taking charge of the scene. One of the paramedics knelt down beside the protagonist, quickly assessing the situation. "We need to get her to the hospital now," the paramedic said, his voice calm but firm as he moved into action. The protagonist felt a brief flicker of hope, but couldn't tear their eyes away from their daughter's pained expression. Every second counted, and yet it felt like time was slipping away faster than it should. The paramedics worked quickly, positioning their daughter onto a stretcher, hooking her up to oxygen, and starting in four as they prepared to rush her to the nearest hospital. The protagonist felt an overwhelming need to follow, to stay close, but they knew they had to stay behind for one crucial thing: the confrontation with the woman who had done this. As the paramedics loaded the stretcher into the ambulance, the protagonist turned back to the park, their eyes locking onto Karen. She hadn't moved. In fact, Karen appeared to be standing still, almost frozen in time, her eyes fixed on the scene, but lacking any visible remorse. She was no longer a threat in the physical sense, but the way she stood there, without any visible reaction to the horror she had just caused, felt more unsettling than anything else. It was as if she had accepted what she'd done and was waiting for the inevitable to come. The police, having cordoned off the area, now moved toward Karen, their expressions grim. Two officers approached her, their hands resting lightly on their holstered weapons, but there was no urgency in their movements. They had seen this before: domestic violence, unpredictable behavior, but never on this scale. One of the officers spoke to Karen, asking her calmly to turn around and place her hands behind her back. "You're under arrest for the shooting," he said, his voice steady, betraying no emotion. Karen didn't react at first, her gaze still distant, almost vacant. She was fully aware of what was happening, of the police presence and the seriousness of the situation, but she showed no signs of fear, no indication that she understood the magnitude of her actions. Karen's response was almost eerie in its calmness. She simply nodded, her lips curling into a faint, almost absent-minded smile as she turned her back to the officers, submitting to the arrest without resistance. She didn't say a word, not a single apology or explanation, just the quiet surrender of someone who had made peace with their own delusions. As the officers cuffed her and began to walk her away, the protagonist stood frozen, watching the woman who had just shattered their life. The sight of Karen being led away in handcuffs should have brought a sense of justice, but it only deepened the hollow ache in their chest. Their daughter was still fighting for her life, and the weight of the pain was almost unbearable. The police were swift in their movements, their presence a stark contrast to the chaos that still simmered in the park. Two officers approached Karen, their expressions stern but professional, knowing the gravity of the situation. They had witnessed enough violence to recognize the seriousness of the crime, but nothing could prepare them for the woman they were about to arrest. Karen, standing motionless at the edge of the park, was eerily calm. Her hands hung at her sides, her posture rigid and unyielding. There was no panic in her eyes, no fear or remorse, just an unsettling calm that seemed out of place in the midst of the frenzy. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for the shooting of a child," one of the officers said, his voice firm but measured as he approached her. Karen didn't flinch. She didn't react at all. Her eyes remained distant, unfocused, as though she were lost in her own world. The officer's words seemed to float around her, but she didn't seem to register them. She didn't move when the officer gently placed a hand on her arm, signaling her to comply. "You need to come with us," the officer continued, his voice now carrying a sense of urgency. Still, Karen did not respond. It was as if she had heard the words but had no intention of acknowledging them. The officer's hand tightened around her arm, guiding her toward the police car. But Karen stood still, rooted in place. For a moment, the scene seemed frozen, Karen unmoving, almost statuesque, while the officer stood beside her, unsure of how to proceed. It wasn't until a second officer stepped forward, placing a hand on Karen's other arm, that she seemed to snap out of her daze. She turned her head slowly to face them, her eyes glassy, unfocused. "It had to happen," she muttered, her voice a soft, almost inaudible whisper. She needed to learn to respect authority. The officers exchanged a quick glance, unsure of how to react to her bizarre response. They had seen their fair share of delusional individuals, but nothing compared to the chilling calm that Karen exhibited. Despite her lack of resistance, there was something deeply unsettling about her indifference to the seriousness of the situation. The protagonist, standing just a few feet away, watched the scene unfold in stunned silence. They could barely process what was happening. Karen, the woman they had known for years as a neighbor, a seemingly mild-mannered member of the community, was now under arrest for shooting their daughter. The reality of the situation was beyond anything they could have imagined. Their mind raced, trying to make sense of it all, but it was as if the world had suddenly turned upside down. As the officers began to handcuff Karen, the protagonist's thoughts spiraled. How could this have happened? How had things gone so horribly wrong? The protagonist's mind flashed back to the years they had spent in the same neighborhood, the casual conversations with Karen at neighborhood gatherings, the times they had exchanged pleasantries as they passed each other in the street. Karen had always been distant, maybe a bit too intense at times, but never violent. Never in a million years did they imagine she was capable of this. They remembered the times Karen had offered unsolicited advice on parenting, her critical tone barely concealed under the guise of concern. The protagonist had brushed it off, chalking it up to Karen's overbearing nature, but now it felt like a distant warning they had failed to heed. What had driven her to this point? Was there a breaking point they hadn't seen? Was there something more sinister hiding beneath her seemingly perfect exterior? As the handcuffs clicked shut around Karen's wrists, the protagonist felt a sickening sense of betrayal. They had trusted her. They had never imagined that someone they had known for so long, someone they had exchanged pleasantries with, could do something so horrific. The anger, the confusion, the disbelief, it all swirled within them, each emotion crashing against the other, making it impossible to focus on anything other than the brutal reality of what had just unfolded. Karen was led away, her gaze never once flickering with guilt or emotion. She was a woman detached from the chaos she had created, and as the protagonist stood there, watching her disappear into the back of the police car, they could only wonder what had happened to the Karen they once knew. And more importantly, how had she become this cold, calculating figure who had taken so much from him? The sterile, cold air of the hospital felt like a stark contrast to the warmth of the day they had just shared in the park. The protagonist paced nervously in the waiting room, each step heavy with the weight of fear and uncertainty. Their heart raced in their chest, and every passing minute felt like an eternity. The walls, blank and impersonal, seemed to close in on them as the silence grew unbearable. They couldn't sit. They couldn't stop moving. Their mind was a blur, replaying every moment from the park, each second of that fateful afternoon now seared into their memory. The sounds of the gunshot, the sight of their daughter crumpling to the ground, the overwhelming flood of panic, it all felt too real to escape. They glanced at the clock on the wall, the ticking seconds an agonizing reminder that time was moving forward while they were stuck in a nightmare, unable to move beyond the moment of violence that had shattered their world. The hospital's fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting an eerie glow on everything, and the distant hum of medical equipment seemed to blend into the background noise. Each beep, each distant sound from the halls, felt like a cruel mockery of their desperate prayers. They had begged for their daughter to survive. They had promised themselves that they wouldn't leave her side. But now, here they were, trapped in this sterile waiting room, helpless and desperate for answers that didn't come. The door to the emergency room burst open, and a group of doctors and nurses hurried past, their faces grim, their steps urgent. The protagonist's heart skipped a beat. The intensity of their movements, the quiet urgency in their voices, told the protagonist that this was no routine procedure. They watched as the medical team rushed down the hall, disappearing behind the swinging doors, and a chill ran down their spine. Please don't let her be one of those cases, the ones that never leave the operating table. Minutes stretched into hours, but to the protagonist, it felt like they had been pacing forever. The worry gnawed at them, deep and insistent, until it consumed every thought. They fought the urge to scream, to lash out at anyone and everything, but they knew it wouldn't change anything. Their daughter's life was in the hands of these doctors and nurses, and they could only wait. The room was suffocating with tension, and yet all they could do was pray that the daughter they had raised, the little girl who had once filled their home with laughter and light, would survive. Then, just as the protagonist's knees threatened to buckle from exhaustion, the door to the waiting room opened. A nurse, calm but visibly tired, stepped inside. Her face was kind, but the slight furrow in her brow hinted at the weight of the situation. "Are you the family of the young girl brought in with gunshot wounds?" she asked softly, her voice like a balm to the protagonist's frayed nerves. Yes, that's her. How is she? Is she going to be okay?" The protagonist's voice cracked with desperation, their words barely a whisper as they stepped forward. The nurse hesitated for a moment, as if weighing her words carefully. "We're doing everything we can," she said, her tone reassuring but cautious. "She's stable for now, but it's touch and go. She's lost a lot of blood, and there's significant damage. We've got her in surgery right now." The protagonist felt a wave of relief and dread wash over them. Stable for now. That phrase haunted them. It was the sliver of hope they clung to, but it also carried the weight of uncertainty. How long could for now last? They nodded numbly, the nurse's words barely registering as they tried to hold onto the small shred of hope she had offered. She gave them a sympathetic look before leaving, and the protagonist was once again left alone with their thoughts. As they sank into the hard, uncomfortable chair in the corner of the room, memories of their daughter flooded their mind. They could still see her face so clearly in their mind, her bright, innocent smile, her wild energy as she ran around the house, always laughing, always playing. The way she would jump into their arms for a hug, her little fingers wrapped around their neck, her face lighting up with joy. How was it that just hours ago she had been so full of life, so full of potential? How had this tragedy descended upon them so suddenly, so violently? The memories became a cruel reminder of what had been stolen from them, of what was still at risk. The protagonist's chest tightened with the weight of these reflections, but they couldn't help but hold onto them. These memories were all they had now. They clung to the image of their daughter's laughter, her innocence, hoping beyond hope that those days of joy would not be forever erased. Suddenly, the silence of the waiting room was broken by a faint ringing sound, the phone at the nurse's station. The protagonist's heart stopped, and they froze, every muscle tense. The minutes felt like hours, each second stretching into an unbearable eternity. Would this be the call they feared? Would it bring them the news they prayed never came? They could feel their breath quicken, their thoughts spiraling as they waited for that moment, that phone call, to change everything. The investigation into the shooting began almost immediately after the police had secured the scene. The park, once filled with families and children, now felt like a crime scene, the air thick with tension and uncertainty. Officers moved swiftly, interviewing witnesses who had been in the vicinity during the chaos. Some were visibly shaken, others in shock, recounting what they had seen with trembling voices. The protagonist stood to the side, their heart heavy as they watched the officers work. They had been so consumed by the trauma of the event, by the sight of their daughter on the ground, that they had hardly registered the aftermath. Now, as the police took statements and gathered evidence, the protagonist felt the weight of the situation pressed down on them even more. A detective approached them, her expression both professional and sympathetic. "I need to ask you a few questions," she said gently, her tone soft but firm. The protagonist nodded numbly, the pain of the past few hours still fresh in their mind. They followed the detective to a quiet corner of the park, away from the activity, where the scene felt a little less frantic. "Can you tell me what happened from the beginning?" the detective asked, her notebook open and ready to take notes. The protagonist's voice trembled as they began to recount the events of the day, how they had arrived at the park, how their daughter had been playing and laughing, and how Karen had approached them. The protagonist's mind wandered back to those moments of tension when Karen had made her unsettling comments. It all felt like a distant dream now, something that had happened to someone else. They spoke of Karen's behavior, the strange, critical remarks, the uncomfortable energy in the air. But it wasn't just the confrontation that stuck with the protagonist, it was the chilling calm in Karen's eyes as she pulled out the weapon and shot their daughter. The memory made their stomach churn. They tried to hold it together as they spoke, but the emotion caught in their throat. The detective listened intently, her pen moving swiftly across the paper. She didn't interrupt, just nodded occasionally, signaling for the protagonist to continue. As the protagonist finished their statement, the detective made a few quick notes. "Thank you. We're going to gather as much evidence as we can. It's crucial that we understand what led to this," she said, her tone professional but with a hint of empathy. "We'll be in touch once we have more information." The detective turned and walked away, joining the rest of the team who were still combing through the scene. In the days that followed, the investigation intensified. The police began digging into Karen's background, searching for any signs of motive or past behavior that might explain her actions. It wasn't long before her history with the Homeowners Association, HOA, came to light. The HOA, a tight-knit community organization responsible for maintaining the neighborhood, had long been a source of tension for Karen. She had been involved in several disputes with neighbors over the years, particularly over noise complaints and property maintenance. Many of the complaints were about her critical attitude toward other families, her constant monitoring of what was happening in the neighborhood, and her tendency to approach others with unsolicited advice. As the police delved deeper, they found that Karen had a history of escalating minor conflicts into full-blown confrontations. Neighbors had reported her as a busybody, constantly involved in other people's business, and there had been multiple instances where her interactions had caused tension and discomfort. Some even described her as unhinged, a word that now seemed eerily fitting given what had just transpired. For the protagonist, the more they learned about Karen's past, the more they felt a strange mixture of anger and confusion. How could this woman, this neighbor, this person they had interacted with on a regular basis, be capable of such an act of violence? It was hard to reconcile the image of Karen they had known, the woman who had made small talk at neighborhood events, with the one who had shot their daughter in cold blood. The investigation painted a portrait of a woman who had slowly spiraled into delusion, convinced that her actions were justified, that her need for control and discipline outweighed everything else. Meanwhile, the protagonists struggled to make sense of their own emotions. They were torn between seeking justice for their daughter and trying to heal from the trauma of what had happened. The thought of Karen facing legal consequences was both comforting and terrifying. On the one hand, it was what their daughter deserved, the justice that would give some sense of closure to the nightmare. But on the other hand, the process felt daunting, a constant reminder of the pain they were all enduring. Every time the phone rang, every time they received an update from the police, it felt like another wave of grief crashing over them. The investigation, while crucial to the pursuit of justice, only deepened the wound. The protagonist was caught between the need for closure and the overwhelming desire to protect their daughter from the reality of what had happened. But even as the investigation pressed forward, one thing was clear: there would be no easy answers, no simple resolution. Just the long, painful road ahead. The legal battle began in earnest just weeks after the shooting, and the weight of it all settled heavily on the protagonist's shoulders. The preliminary hearings were held in a crowded courtroom, the air thick with tension. The walls, once ordinary, now felt suffocating, each passing moment dragging them deeper into the reality of what had happened. The protagonist, dressed in black, sat quietly at the back, their hands folded tightly in their lap, trying to steady their shaking nerves. The sound of shuffling papers, the low murmur of whispered conversations, and the clattering of the judge's gavel filled the room, but the protagonist's focus remained on the empty seat opposite them, the seat where Karen's defense team would soon sit. The doors to the courtroom creaked open, and Karen's defense team filed in. They were sharp, professional, and confident in their demeanor, a stark contrast to the chaos of the protagonist's world. As Karen walked in, flanked by her lawyers, the protagonist's heart skipped a beat. There she was, standing tall, her face unreadable, her eyes meeting the protagonist's for just a second before she turned away. The lack of emotion on her face was almost more unsettling than anything else, a cold reminder of the nightmare that had been her doing. She didn't look remorseful. She didn't look afraid. She simply looked as if this was just another day in the life of a woman who had already justified her actions in her mind. The protagonist could feel their anger flaring, but they tried to focus on the task at hand. The proceedings began, and the defense attorney took the floor first. His voice was smooth and calculated, carefully crafted to make the case seem less about the violence and more about mitigating circumstances. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began, what we have here is a case of an individual who acted out of fear. Karen, my client, was not a violent woman. She was a concerned member of her community trying to maintain order. We all know that children today can be difficult to handle, and when she felt threatened, she made a split-second decision, one that she now deeply regrets. But this was not premeditated violence. It was a tragic mistake. The defense attorney's words were like a slap in the face, the implications of what he was saying gnawing at the protagonist. The suggestion that Karen's actions had been driven by fear, that this had been an accident, was not only insulting, but felt like an attempt to diminish the gravity of what had been done. The protagonist's hand clenched into a fist as they fought to stay composed. Karen's defense team painted her as a victim of circumstance, an ordinary woman pushed too far. But the protagonist knew the truth that the defense was trying so desperately to obscure. Karen had aimed the gun, pulled the trigger, and shot their daughter. The prosecutor stood next, a middle-aged woman with a calm, yet firm demeanor. She took a moment to collect her thoughts before addressing the court. What we are dealing with here is not a momentary lapse in judgment. It is a deliberate act of violence. A young child was shot in cold blood by someone who had no business carrying a weapon, someone who had crossed the line from concerned neighbor to dangerous aggressor. The emotional and physical toll on this family is incalculable, and we cannot allow such behavior to go unpunished. Her voice rang with clarity, each word cutting through the murky fog of the defense's argument. The prosecutor's words gave the protagonist a glimmer of hope, the first real sense that the court was beginning to understand the gravity of what had happened. The protagonist sat up straighter, the tension in their chest easing ever so slightly. But it was a fleeting moment of relief, for soon it would be their turn to speak. The judge turned to the protagonist, signaling them to approach the witness stand. The room went quiet, the eyes of the courtroom fixed on them. The protagonist stood, their legs unsteady, their heart pounding so loudly it felt as if it might burst from their chest. As they stepped to the stand, they could feel the weight of every gaze on them. The familiar sense of being on display, the vulnerability of exposing their grief, felt unbearable. But they knew they had to speak. They had to make the court see the pain that their family had suffered. When the protagonists began their statement, their voice was shaky at first. "I never thought something like this would happen to my family. I never imagined that one day I would be sitting here speaking about the day my daughter was shot, about the woman who took her innocence away, who almost took her life." The words caught in their throat, but they pressed on. The physical wounds are just the beginning. Yes, my daughter is fighting to survive, but we are all fighting too, fighting to rebuild a life that was stolen from us in a single moment. The protagonist's eyes welled with tears as they continued, their words coming faster now, fueled by the raw emotion they could no longer contain. "Every day, I wake up and wonder if today will be the day I have to say goodbye to my child. Every night, I lie awake, listening for her breathing, waiting for the sound that tells me she's still with us. I have to watch her struggle, to see her fight for every moment of normalcy she once had. And it's not just her, my entire family has been affected. The fear, the trauma, it's something none of us will ever truly escape." The room was silent as the protagonist finished, their statement hanging in the air. They felt drained, exposed, but also a small sense of relief. They had spoken the truth. The pain, the suffering, it was all out in the open now. As they looked around the courtroom, they saw the faces of the jury, the judge, and the defense attorneys. There was no turning back now. The battle for justice had begun, and the protagonist had given everything they had to make sure that the truth was heard. The media frenzy surrounding the case erupted almost overnight. What had begun as a local incident quickly spiraled into national news, with every major outlet picking up the story. The courthouse, once a solemn building reserved for legal proceedings, was now surrounded by a swarm of reporters and camera crews. News vans lined the streets, satellite dishes raised toward the sky, and reporters with microphones in hand stood at the ready, eager for any statement, any detail they could get their hands on. The scene outside was chaotic, a frenzy of flashing lights and clashing voices, as journalists clamored for their turn to speak to anyone connected to the case. The protagonist's family, once private citizens, had become the subject of constant scrutiny, and their lives were no longer their own. As the trial continued, the cameras never stopped rolling. Outside the courthouse, reporters staked out positions, hoping for a glimpse of the family, any sign of them. The protagonist's every move, every exit from the courthouse was tracked, their image flashed on news screens across the country. The constant presence of the media was suffocating. The protagonist felt like they couldn't step outside without being bombarded by questions, flashes of cameras, and the unrelenting buzz of media speculation. Every time they left the courtroom, the air seemed thick with the weight of the press, the relentless pursuit of a story that seemed to define their families every moment. The media coverage was relentless, and it wasn't long before the protagonist's family found themselves at the center of public opinion. Some people sympathized, sending messages of support, writing heartfelt letters about how the family's strength had inspired them. These moments of kindness were brief, drowned out by the louder, more aggressive voices of critics. Others criticized the protagonist for not speaking out enough, for not taking a more visible stand in front of the cameras. Every word, every action was analyzed, dissected, and judged. The community's opinions seemed divided. Some were furious with Karen's actions and rallied behind the family, while others were less sympathetic, questioning the protagonist's decision to pursue the legal battle so fervently. The spotlight was impossible to escape. The protagonist felt a strange, almost nauseating sense of exposure. They had always been a private person, their life once simple and quiet, but now they were thrust into a public spectacle, their pain and grief laid bare for the world to see. Every interview, every statement made in court was twisted, reworded, and replayed endlessly on television. It was an endless loop, and no matter where the protagonist turned, the media was there, waiting, watching, hoping for something new to report. In the midst of it all, the protagonist felt both empowered and overwhelmed. On the one hand, the media attention brought awareness to the case, ensuring that the fight for justice wasn't ignored. It was a necessary evil, a tool that could help secure the future of their daughter and ensure that Karen faced the consequences of her actions. But the price of that awareness came at a cost. The constant attention, the public scrutiny, made every decision feel like a spectacle. The protagonist no longer felt like a person. They felt like a headline, a story to be followed, dissected, and consumed by a public that knew nothing about their true pain. It was a battle for control, a tug of war between seeking justice for their daughter and protecting the privacy of their family. But as the media frenzy continued, the protagonist found it harder and harder to tell the difference between the two. The story of their family, once a private tragedy, was now public property, and they had no choice but to navigate the storm. The day of the courtroom showdown had arrived, and the atmosphere in the courthouse was thick with anticipation. The jury, seated in the quiet rows, appeared tense, their eyes occasionally shifting toward the defendant's table. The courtroom was filled with the low murmur of whispered conversations, the sound of chairs creaking as people shifted in their seats. The protagonist sat in the front row, their hands gripping the armrests tightly, trying to steady their racing heart. Their eyes flicked toward Karen, sitting at the defense table, her face an emotionless mask. The silence was broken as the judge entered, and the proceedings officially began. Court is now in session, the judge announced, his voice steady and commanding. The courtroom fell silent in an instant. The defense and prosecution teams stood, and the trial began in earnest. The first witness called to the stand was the protagonist, their voice trembling as they stepped into the witness box. The weight of the moment hung heavily in the air as the court watched them, and the protagonist's mind raced, trying to recall every detail of that harrowing day. The defense had painted a picture of a tragic, misunderstood situation, but the protagonist knew the truth. They had witnessed their daughter's innocence torn away in an act of cold violence. With the eyes of the jury upon them, the protagonist began to recount the events of the day. Their voice was shaky at first, the words coming slowly as they recalled the serene moments before the shooting. The park had been quiet, peaceful, a place of refuge for a simple afternoon out with their daughter. She was laughing, playing, just being a child, the protagonist said, their voice thick with emotion. We had no idea what was coming. They paused, struggling to hold back the flood of emotions threatening to spill over. And then Karen, she walked up to us. I don't know why, but she started to speak to me, her tone critical, judgmental. I didn't think anything of it at first. I thought we'd just have a brief conversation and go on with our day. As they spoke, the memories flooded back, Karen's unsettling presence, the harsh words, the way Karen had made a comment about their daughter's behavior. And then, out of nowhere, she pulled out a gun, the protagonist continued, their voice faltering. I didn't even see her draw it. 1 minute she was standing there, and the next, she shot my daughter. My baby. She didn't even flinch. The room grew quiet, the weight of the testimony settling over everyone in the courtroom. The protagonist's words hung in the air, raw and heartbreaking. The entire courtroom felt the devastation of that moment. Karen's defense attorney stood next, his voice calm and collected as he began to cross-examine the protagonist. He attempted to undermine their testimony, trying to paint Karen as a woman who had simply overreacted in a moment of fear. Isn't it true, the lawyer asked, that your daughter was being loud and disruptive? Isn't it possible that Karen simply felt threatened by your child's behavior? The defense attorney's tone was smooth, his words calculated. Perhaps she acted out of fear, not malice. The protagonist's jaw tightened, and they held their ground. No, they replied firmly. My daughter was just a child. She wasn't doing anything wrong. Karen's actions were deliberate, cold. There was no fear in her eyes, only anger. She didn't shoot out of fear. She shot because she wanted to. The defense lawyer paused, seemingly taken aback by the strength in the protagonist's voice. The room seemed to hold its breath as the protagonist's words resonated with everyone present. There was no mistaking the truth now. The defense could try to twist the story, but the evidence and the testimony were undeniable. Next, the prosecution took their turn. The prosecutor's voice was strong, unwavering, as she stood to address the jury. She began by outlining the events with precision, recounting the protagonist's testimony and the undeniable facts. This was not a tragic accident. This was an act of violence, a senseless, premeditated act carried out by a woman who had no regard for the sanctity of life, the prosecutor stated. Karen knew exactly what she was doing. She pulled the trigger with clear intent, and now a family is torn apart because of her actions. The prosecutor's words were sharp, each one cutting through the defenses Karen's lawyer had put forth. We heard from the defendant's attorney that this was a momentary lapse in judgment. The prosecutor continued, turning to the jury. But the evidence speaks for itself. This wasn't a momentary lapse. This was an intentional, deliberate act. A child was shot. A mother watched her daughter's life hang in the balance, and the woman who did this showed no remorse. That is the reality here. The jury sat in rapt attention, the prosecutor's words holding them captive. The gravity of the case was becoming undeniable, and the truth was starting to sink in with the jury. They could see through the defense's tactics, the smoke and mirrors meant to distract from the core issue. Karen had shot an innocent child in cold blood, and now it was time for justice. The final moments of the trial felt like an eternity. The prosecutor's closing argument was compelling, precise, and emotionally charged. The jury, their faces grim, absorbed every word. The protagonist's heart raced as they sat, waiting for the final decision, knowing that this courtroom showdown would determine the outcome of their family's fight for justice. The courtroom fell into a tense silence as the jury filed in, each one taking their seat, their faces unreadable. The air was thick with anticipation. The judge glanced at the foreperson, who stood slowly and nodded. The moment the words, "We have reached a verdict," were spoken, the protagonist felt their stomach twist with a mixture of dread and hope. Their heart pounded in their chest as the foreperson handed the verdict to the judge, who unfolded the paper and scanned it for a moment before looking up. Karen Anderson, the judge began, his voice steady but filled with gravity. The jury has found you guilty of attempted murder and assault. A wave of emotion surged through the protagonist's body. Relief, anger, disbelief. all tangled together in an overwhelming rush. The words were finally spoken. Justice, in some form, had been delivered, but there was no celebration, no sense of triumph. Just the weight of what had been lost, the destruction of their world still hanging heavily over them. Karen sat still, her face as emotionless as ever, her eyes cast down as the court erupted in murmurs. She had expected this, the protagonist thought, as the officers moved to stand by her. She had been ready for this moment, indifferent to the consequences of her actions. To her, the verdict seemed to barely register. The protagonist wanted to scream, to hurl their anger at her, but the truth was, there was nothing left to say. The woman who had tried to destroy their family had been found guilty, and now it was time for the sentencing. As the courtroom cleared out for a brief recess before sentencing, the protagonists sat in their seat. Barely able to move, the emotional weight of the trial finally crashing down on them. Their eyes welled up with tears, but they couldn't bring themselves to cry. It felt like too much, a decade of pain, anger, confusion, and heartache condensed into a few hours of courtroom drama. They had relived the moment of the shooting, the trauma of seeing their daughter on the ground, and the aftermath of watching their life unravel in front of their eyes. But now it was over, or so they thought. In the brief moments of quiet that followed, the protagonist reflected on the toll the trial had taken. Every day had been an emotional roller coaster, sitting through witness testimonies, feeling the weight of the media's watchful gaze, enduring the constant reminders of what had happened. The courtroom had been a battlefield, but it had also been a place of healing, a place where their story had been heard, where their daughter's pain was finally acknowledged. And yet, there was a void that no verdict could fill. No amount of justice could undo the trauma their family had suffered. They had won the fight for justice, but the emotional scars would remain forever. When the sentencing hearing began, the air was once again heavy with anticipation. Karen was led into the courtroom, her hands shackled, her face still as cold and unyielding as ever. The protagonist's eyes never left her, their mind replaying the moments that had led them here. Their daughter's smile, her laughter, the innocence of a child who had been robbed of her future by this woman's madness. The prosecutor stood first, laying out the details of the crime, highlighting the emotional and physical toll the shooting had taken on the family. Karen Anderson, the court has found you guilty of attempted murder and assault. You have taken a mother's peace, and you have broken a family, the prosecutor said, her voice firm. It is time to pay for your actions. Then it was Karen's turn. Her defense attorney stood, arguing for a lesser sentence, citing her apparent remorse, though the protagonist had seen none of it. Karen's eyes flickered briefly toward the defense team, her expression unchanged, and the protagonist couldn't help but feel disgusted by her calm demeanor. There was no true remorse, no sense of accountability. Karen had only done what she thought was necessary to control a situation she hadn't liked. The prosecutor's voice returned, delivering the final statement. Justice must be served, not only for the victim, but for the community. We cannot allow this behavior to go unpunished. The sentence must reflect the severity of the crime. The judge considered for a moment before announcing the sentence. Karen would serve 25 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 20. The words hung in the air as the courtroom fell silent. The protagonist, hearing the sentence, felt a sense of finality, but there was no satisfaction, no relief, only a cold, aching emptiness. The decision had been made, and justice had been served in the eyes of the law, but it couldn't undo the trauma, the brokenness, or the years of healing that lay ahead. As Karen was led away in handcuffs, her expression unchanged, the protagonist allowed themselves a moment to breathe. The battle for justice was over, but their journey had just begun. The fight for healing, for rebuilding what had been shattered, would take years. There was no quick fix. The scars would remain on their daughter, on their family, and on their hearts. But for the first time in a long while, the protagonist felt a small flicker of hope, knowing that their family would now have the chance to heal, to move forward, even if the process was long and painful. The road ahead was uncertain, but they knew one thing for sure: justice had been served. And in that, they would find the strength to rebuild. If you or someone you know has experienced a similar injustice, don't stay silent. Speak up, stand firm, and seek the justice you deserve. Every voice matters, and every story deserves to be heard. Share the story, raise awareness, and support those fighting for justice. We can't change the past, but together we can make a difference in the future. Take action now, because justice is not just a right, it's a responsibility.